Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of the people who watch these stories never subscribe? Most of them listen quietly and disappear. If you're enjoying the content, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. Don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction tells me you're really here. And tell me, where are you watching from right now? Okay, before we begin the story, I want to ask you something important. If you heard your name whispered from the darkness, would you keep listening? Have you ever driven through Yellowstone in winter, when the snow swallows the road and the pines seem to lean closer the deeper you go? Out here, the land speaks first. Wide valleys frozen solid. Forests so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat echo inside your parka. At first, it's peaceful. Then it's isolating. Then you realize how easy it would be to disappear without anyone noticing. If you've ever been near a place like this, you already understand. And if you haven't, listen closely. My name is Ethan Calder. I'm a National Park Service Ranger, assigned to the northeast sector of Yellowstone, near the Lamar Valley backcountry. I've worn this badge for 14 winters, covering nearly 90 square miles alone once the snow closes the roads. People think this job is about wildlife and lost tourists. What they don't tell you is how lonely it gets, or how fast things go wrong when you're the only voice on the radio. I thought I understood this job. I was wrong, because there are things I've seen out there in December, things that don't exist in manuals, aren't taught in training, and never, ever make it into an official report. I've kept this off the record for years, but what happened at Christmas still wakes me up. I shouldn't be telling this. Not now, not ever. Rangers are trained to stay quiet, to protect the image of the park as much as the people in it. But some memories refuse orders. They surface at night, sharp as frost, demanding to be named. That winter, radios failed without pattern. Snow buried trail markers overnight. My partner, someone I trusted with my life, began asking why certain routes vanished from maps, why dispatch went silent near the pines. I had answers once. I didn't then. If you worked a job where rules stopped making sense, you know the fear isn't loud. I was stationed deep in the backcountry. No backup, no witnesses, no margin for error. And I learned some sections of Yellowstone aren't closed for safety. They're closed because something out there remembers us. They told me the post was quiet, but Yellowstone is never quiet in December. The assignment came down 3 days before Christmas, slipped into my inbox with the same bland language they use for routine patrol shifts. Temporary winter coverage, low visitor activity, minimal incidents expected. That was the phrasing. It always is. But anyone who's worked this park long enough knows winter doesn't make Yellowstone calmer. It strips it bare. No tourists, no noise, no margin for mistakes. The northeast sector had gone understaffed after 2 rangers transferred out and 1 went on medical leave. That left a gap of nearly 90 square miles stretching from the edge of Lamar Valley into dense pine backcountry most people only see on postcards. In summer, it's busy. In winter, it's a white void. 1 ranger per shift. Sometimes less, if weather grounded snowmobiles. I didn't argue the assignment. Seniority has its perks, but it also comes with expectations. You don't say no when dispatch needs coverage. You don't ask why others declined. You just load your gear, check your radio, and head out. Winter protocols are drilled into us from day one. Extra fuel, extra flares, hourly radio check-ins. Stick to marked routes. Avoid closed trails unless authorized. And above all, respect dead zones. Yellowstone's terrain eats radio signals. Valleys swallow them whole. Dense stands of pine bend them, until voices come back warped or not at all. The first day out, the cold hit harder than forecasted. -20 before wind chill. Snow, so dry it squeaked under my boots. The kind of cold that makes metal burn your skin and drains batteries twice as fast as they should. I logged my position at the ranger station, signed out a snowmobile, and headed north as the sun disappeared behind the ridgeline far earlier than I expected. Isolation settles in fast out there. The trees close ranks once you leave the road. Pines stretch endlessly, their branches sagging under fresh snow, Muffling sound until even your own movements feel intrusive. No birds, no wind, just the steady hum of the engine and the crunch beneath it. About 8 miles in, my radio crackled, then went dead. I stopped, tapped it, checked the antenna. Nothing. I waited the required 2 minutes before logging the failure in my notebook. Dead zones happen. You note it. You move on. The first track showed up near an old fire road, half buried but unmistakable once I slowed down. Too large for coyote. Wrong spacing for wolf. Not quite bear. Too narrow. Too deliberate. They cut across the trail at an angle, heading deeper into the trees. I told myself it was erosion or overlapping prints distorted by snowfall. That's the rational answer. It's the one training gives you. Still, I dismounted and studied them longer than protocol required. They didn't wander. They didn't hesitate. Whatever made them was moving with purpose. By nightfall, the temperature dropped further, and the world took on that hollow, unreal quality winter brings. Sound doesn't travel right in extreme cold. Distances lie. A tree 50 yards away can feel like it's breathing down your neck. If you've ever worked nights alone, really alone, you know that feeling. The sense that the dark isn't empty. It's attentive. I reached the temporary outpost just before full dark. One structure. Generator-powered lights. A radio repeater that worked when it felt like it. I logged in, ran equipment checks, and tried dispatch again. Static. Then a fragment of my own voice echoing back at me. Delayed and warped. I shut the radio off. The second day, snow fell hard enough to erase my tracks within minutes. Patrol routes vanished behind me. The park felt less like land and more like an idea. Something vast and indifferent that didn't care whether I existed inside it or not. That's when I found more tracks. Closer this time. Paralleling my route instead of crossing it. Always just far enough into the trees that I had to strain to see them. I didn't follow them. Rangers don't chase unknown wildlife alone in winter. You document. You avoid escalation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't patrolling alone. By the third night, the silence felt heavier. Pressurized. The generator sputtered twice before stabilizing. My breath fogged the windows from the inside. When I stepped out for a perimeter check, the forest seemed closer than it had any right to be. The pines pressing inward as if the snow itself were narrowing the space. I caught myself listening for footsteps that never came. When my partner finally arrived to rotate shifts, I felt a relief I hadn't realized I needed. 2 people changes everything. 2 sets of eyes. 2 radios. 2 voices to confirm you're not imagining things. But the moment he looked at the trees and asked quietly, "Has it always felt like this out here?" I knew the assignment wasn't going to stay routine. As we powered up the snowmobiles and headed toward a stretch of forest marked closed on official maps, the radio crackled again, just once. And this time, it sounded like someone breathing. There's a trail that doesn't show up on tourist maps, and for good reason. The breathing on the radio faded as quickly as it came, replaced by static, so clean it felt intentional. My partner looked at me, waiting for an explanation I didn't give. I shut the unit off and told him interference was common in cold weather. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. The stretch of forest we were heading toward wasn't marked closed in the usual way. No barricades. No warning signs nailed to trees. On official maps, it simply didn't exist. A blank space between 2 maintained routes, as if the land itself had been erased by a drafting error. But every ranger who'd worked the northeast sector long enough knew about it. We called it the Pine Corridor. Not officially, just something passed down during late-night briefings and exhausted conversations over bad coffee. A narrow cut through dense lodgepole pines where snow settled deeper, radios failed faster, and patrol logs grew vague. You weren't forbidden from entering it. You were discouraged. Strongly. Repeatedly. Without explanation. I'd heard about it my first winter in Yellowstone. An older ranger, Tom Alvarez, 25 years in, had pulled me aside after a training exercise and asked how much I trusted maps. When I answered wrong, he smiled without humor and told me some places weren't meant to be navigated, only avoided. Then he changed the subject and never brought up again. That's how warnings work out here. They aren't written down. They're spoken softly and only once. As we approach the edge of the corridor, the trees thicken unnaturally fast. Pines packed so close together their branches intertwined, creating a tunnel of shadow even in daylight. Snow lay untouched beneath them, smooth and pristine in a way that made my skin crawl. No animal tracks, no wind disturbance, just emptiness. My partner slowed his snowmobile. "This trail's not on my map," he said. "It's not supposed to be," I replied. We dismounted and continued on foot, per protocol for unmarked areas. Radio stayed off, not because the rules said so, but because every ranger who ignored that instinct regretted it. Sound behaves strangely in the corridor. Voices travel too far, or not at all. Sometimes they come back changed. There are stories about that place, not the kind you tell tourists. Stories pass with respect, not fear. The land here predates the park, predates the uniform I wear. Indigenous communities have lived alongside it for generations, and their oral histories speak of places where the forest listens, where boundaries exist that aren't meant to be crossed lightly. Those stories were never shared as entertainment. They were shared as instruction. This was one of those places. The rules were simple, though none of them were written anywhere. Don't linger. Don't follow sounds you can't identify. Don't call out names. And above all, if you feel watched, leave immediately. The corridor doesn't respond well to curiosity. We advanced slowly, marking our route with GPS, even though I knew the signal wouldn't hold. Within minutes, my watch buzzed, connection lost. Time felt thick there, like moving through water. 5 minutes stretched. 10 felt like an hour. My breath sounded too loud inside my hood, each exhale echoing faintly between the trees. That's when the forest shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough that when I turned around, the path we'd taken looked longer. The trees behind us seemed farther apart. The snow disturbed in ways I didn't remember making. My internal clock stuttered. I checked my watch again. We'd been inside the corridor for 12 minutes. It felt like much longer. My partner stopped and tilted his head. "Do you hear that?" I listened. At first, nothing. Then a low sound, almost subsonic. Not a growl, not wind, more like pressure. The sensation you get when altitude changes too fast. My ears popped, and suddenly the sound vanished. Probably ice shifting, I said, though we were nowhere near water. We continued, tension building with each step. The light dimmed, though clouds hadn't moved. Shadows stretched in the wrong direction. I realized with a jolt that my footprints ahead of me looked older than the ones behind, as if time wasn't flowing consistently. That's when my partner whispered my name. I turned. He was staring past me, eyes unfocused. "I didn't call you," I said. "I know," he replied. "It came from over there." He pointed deeper into the pines, toward a section of forest so dense it swallowed light entirely. I felt the pull then, subtle, insistent, like the land itself was inviting us closer, urging us to step off the invisible boundary we were clinging to. I remembered Alvarez's voice. "Don't answer back." A crack echoed through the corridor, a tree branch snapping, maybe, or something heavier shifting its weight. Snow slid from a limb somewhere above us, landing without a sound. The silence that followed was absolute. My watch buzzed again. Time reconnected. 12 minutes had become 37. "That's it," I said. "We're done here." As we turned to leave, the pressure eased slightly, like a hell breath being released. The path behind us shortened, the trees relaxing their grip. We didn't speak until we were well clear of the corridor. Radios back on, daylight feeling marginally more real. My partner exhaled shakily. "Why isn't that place closed?" I met his eyes and chose my words carefully. Because closing it would mean admitting why. That night, as we logged the patrol with deliberate vagueness, I caught him staring at the trees outside the outpost. His jaw was tight, his hands trembling despite the heat. Just before turning in, he asked me one last question. "Ethan," he said quietly, "has the forest ever said your name before?" The voice sounded like mine, and that's when I knew we were in trouble. He asked the question quietly, like he was afraid the forest might hear him. "Has the forest ever said your name before?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have one, but because the answer felt like a door I'd kept locked for years. Once opened, it wouldn't close again. My partner's name was Caleb Henson, mid-30s, former EMT before transferring into the Park Service. Solid instincts, steady under pressure, the kind of ranger you want beside you when weather turns or plans fall apart. He had a laugh that carried too far in quiet places, and a habit of narrating his own mistakes out loud, like saying them made them smaller. He trusted rules, trusted procedures, trusted me. That night, trust started to crack. I told him voices in the woods weren't unheard of. Wind through deadfall, auditory pareidolia, stress, cold, all true, all insufficient. He nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the dark beyond the floodlights, as if something out there had leaned closer when we weren't looking. We slept in shifts. Protocol when conditions feel unstable. Radios on low. Exterior lights left running. At some point before dawn, I heard footsteps crunching outside the outpost. Slow, deliberate, circling. I reached for my jacket and stepped out, flashlight cutting through falling snow. Nothing. The tracks ended 10 feet from the door. No return path. No drag marks. Just stopped. The next morning, Caleb admitted he'd heard someone walking around too. Said the steps matched mine. Same rhythm. Same weight. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in his throat. We logged it as wildlife disturbance. Elk will do that sometimes. Walk close. Freeze. Move on. Only elk don't test door handles. As the days passed, the mimicry escalated. It started small. A radio transmission that opened with my call sign, but in my voice, distorted and stretched like it had traveled too far to get back. A call from the trees that sounded exactly like Caleb's, right down to the hitch in his breath. Once, while patrolling opposite sides of a frozen creek, we both stopped at the same time, each convinced the other had called out. We stopped using names. Protocols exist for a reason. When something doesn't make sense, you fall back on them. Increase check-ins. Shorten patrols. Avoid known dead zones. We did all of it. And one by one, the safeguards failed. GPS units lagged and froze. Batteries drained in minutes despite being warm. Our watches disagreed about the time by nearly an hour. Dispatch stopped responding altogether for long stretches, then came back online as if nothing had happened. Caleb suggested we file an incident report, an early withdrawal request due to environmental instability. That would have brought in a relief team. More eyes, more radios, more scrutiny. I hesitated. Reports don't exist in a vacuum. They get reviewed, categorized, explained away. Once you put something like this into writing, it stops being yours. And worse, it stops being real. It becomes a problem to solve, not a warning to heed. That was my failure. I chose silence. The breaking point came during a perimeter sweep just after dusk. Snow was falling sideways, visibility down to a few yards. We moved slowly, keeping each other in sight. At least, I thought we were. I heard Caleb behind me, muttering under his breath the way he always did when he was cold. I turned to answer and saw him 20 yards ahead, staring back at me, face pale. The voice behind me stopped. What were you saying? I asked. I didn't say anything, he replied. We stood there, snow settling between us, both listening. Footsteps crunched to our left. Heavy, bipedal, too measured to be animal. They matched my stride perfectly. Caleb whispered, "Don't turn around." The footsteps stopped when we stopped. Started when we moved. A cruel echo. I felt it then, not fear but recognition. The sense that something was learning us, testing boundaries, practicing. We retreated to the outpost without running. Running invites pursuit. That's another unwritten rule. Inside, we locked the door, killed the exterior lights, and sat in the dark with our backs to the wall. That's when the radio came on by itself. My voice filled the room, calm and professional. "Caleb, you can step outside now. It's safe." He covered his mouth with both hands to keep from responding. I should have called this in, should have broken protocol and demanded extraction. Instead, I reached over and shut the radio off, hands shaking hard enough to rattle the casing. We didn't sleep after that. By morning, Caleb was different, quieter, watching the tree lean like it might move if he blinked. He admitted the voice had said more while I was on watch. Told him things only I knew. Old conversations. Shared jokes. Once, it used his mother's voice. That's when he asked me what this place was. I didn't have a name for it. Only fragments. Old warnings. A sense that the forest wasn't hostile, but territorial. That it didn't hunt the way predators do. It replaced. Slipped into familiar shapes. Waited for mistakes. We argued about leaving. He wanted out immediately. I wanted to wait for daylight, for weather, for confirmation. Every reason I gave sounded thin, even to me. The truth was simpler and worse. If we left, whatever was watching would know it had succeeded. Fear had crossed into something heavier now. A moral weight. Do you protect your partner? Or the boundary you've been tasked to hold? Do you run? Or do you stay quiet and hope the rules still apply? As dusk fell again, the forest pressed closer. Sounds carried wrong. Time skipped. Somewhere in the pines, something practiced my voice, smoother now, more confident. And as Christmas Eve crept closer, I realized we were running out of chances to make the right decision. Christmas Eve was supposed to be routine patrol, until the snow started moving. We marked the date on the log out of habit, not celebration. December 24th. Another line in a notebook that smelled faintly of fuel and cold metal. Somewhere far away, people were stringing lights and arguing over ovens. Out here, the only color came from the emergency beacon blinking red against endless white. We tried to create normalcy. Coffee reheated on the stove. A ration bar split down the middle, like a joke neither of us laughed at. Caleb hummed a tune I didn't recognize, then stopped abruptly, as if he'd realized sound carried too far. The forest pressed close to the outpost windows, pines heavy with snow, unmoving in the early afternoon stillness. Routine patrol meant checking perimeter, scanning for wildlife pushed into unusual routes by weather, confirming that closures were holding. Nothing heroic, nothing dangerous. That was the lie we told ourselves as we suited up. Outside, the cold felt sharper than before, biting through layers like it had learned where to aim. Snow fell in fine sheets, not enough to obscure vision, but enough to soften edges. The world looked unfinished, like someone had erased details and forgotten to redraw them. We moved in a wide loop, spacing ourselves according to protocol, 30 feet apart, line of sight maintained. Radios on but muted. The Lamar pines stood ahead of us, dark and dense, their trunks packed so tightly the forest floor never saw full daylight. Wildlife usually avoided that stretch in winter. Too little forage, too many blind corners. That day, the animals were running. A herd of elk burst from the tree lean to our right, muscles slick with frost, eyes wide and glassy. They didn't follow any established path. They scattered, breaking formation like something had cut through the middle of them. One cow stumbled, scrambled back to her feet, and kept going without looking back. Caleb slowed. "That's not weather behavior," he said. Before I could answer, a pair of coyotes streaked across the clearing behind the elk. Tails tucked, ears flattened. They didn't hunt. They fled. One glanced over its shoulder mid-run and yelped, a high, panicked sound that ended abruptly, like it had been swallowed. The forest went quiet after that. Not the normal quiet, the kind that rings in your ears, but a dense absence of sound, as if the air itself were holding still. We advanced toward the pines despite every instinct screaming not to. This was our job. Observe. Document. Intervene if necessary. The snow beneath our boots looked wrong. Too smooth in places. Disturbed in others. But not by tracks. By pressure. Wide, shallow depressions that shifted subtly as we watched. Caleb froze. "Ethan," he whispered. "Look." The snow ahead of us rippled. Not dramatically. Not like a wave. Just a slow, deliberate rise and fall, as if something large had passed beneath the surface without breaking through. The movement traveled laterally, parallel to the tree lean, keeping pace with us. My stomach dropped. Snow doesn't do that. Wind doesn't do that. Animals don't do that. We backed up in unison, steps careful, measured. The rippling followed, always just beyond the edge of clarity, always refusing to show itself fully. Then it stepped out of the trees. Not all the way, just enough. A shape separated from shadow, taller than any animal had a right to be, its outline bending wrong against the falling snow. It didn't move like a predator. It adjusted subtly, as if aligning itself with us. When it shifted its weight, the ground responded. Snow compressed. Branches bowed. Caleb's breath hitched. That's not. The thing tilted its head and spoke. Caleb, it said in my voice. Perfect cadence. Perfect tone. Even the slight rasp I get when the air is too cold. That was the moment fear turned into certainty. There was no misinterpretation left. No room for rationalization. This wasn't stress or sound or coincidence. It knew us, knew how to reach us, knew which shape would hurt most. Caleb took a step back and stumbled. I grabbed his arm, steadying him, never taking my eyes off the shape. It didn't advance. It didn't retreat. It watched, patient, as if confident we would make the next mistake ourselves. The snow beneath it moved again, faster now, circling, testing. Time stretched thin. Seconds felt elastic. My watch buzzed uselessly, vibrating without displaying anything at all. I raised my rifle, not to fire, but to anchor myself to procedure. The safety click sounded deafening. The shape reacted, not with fear, but with interest. Its outline sharpened for a heartbeat, and I saw too much. Limbs that bent where they shouldn't. A surface that looked like bark and muscle at the same time. No face. Just suggestion. Don't, Caleb whispered, tears freezing on his lashes. It wants that. He was right. The thing leaned forward slightly, as if anticipating the report, as if waiting to learn what we sounded like when we broke. I lowered the rifle. The forest exhaled. The pressure eased just enough for us to move. We retreated, slow and deliberate, never turning our backs. The shape didn't follow, not physically, but the snow continued to shift beside us, tracking our withdrawal until the trees thinned and the outpost lights cut through the gloom. Only then did the movement stop. Inside, we slammed the door and braced it with everything we could. Caleb collapsed on the bench, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. He didn't look at me, didn't speak. I started the generator again, hands numb, mind racing. This was it. The line we couldn't uncross. What we'd seen couldn't be unwritten, couldn't be buried in vague language and half-truths. I reached for the radio. Before I could turn it on, it crackled to life on its own. My voice came through, closer now, clearer. Merry Christmas, it said gently. You're almost ready. Caleb looked up at me then, eyes hollow with understanding. And in that moment, I knew the next patrol wouldn't be about observation. It would be about survival. I finally saw it, and I understood why the forest goes quiet. The radio went dead after that, like it had said everything it needed to say. Caleb, and I didn't speak for a long time. The generator hummed. Snow ticked softly against the windows. Somewhere outside, something waited with a patience that felt ancient. We didn't sleep. We couldn't. Every time the wind shifted, Caleb flinched. Every time the lights flickered, my hand went to my rifle without conscious thought. Authority, training, protocol, none of it meant anything anymore. Out here, the uniform wasn't protection. It was just fabric. At first light, the storm eased. A thin gray dawn bled into the tree-line, revealing a world that looked deceptively normal. No tracks near the outpost. No movement. If not for memory of the snow rippling and the voice wearing mine, I might have convinced myself it had all been fear layered on exhaustion. Caleb knew better. I could see it in his posture, the way his eyes tracked every shadow. It's still there, he said. Not a question. A statement. We debated leaving. Full extraction. Abandoned post. That would have been the rational choice. But something held us. A sense that movement would trigger something worse. Territorial animals behave that way. They don't chase unless you run. They don't strike unless you cross a line. So we crossed one deliberately. We geared up and stepped back into the Lamar Pines. The forest accepted us without resistance. No wind. No birds. Even our footsteps seemed muted, as if the ground itself were absorbing sound. We moved slowly, side by side, rifle slung but ready, every sense stretched thin. That's when I felt it again, the pressure. Not fear. Not threat. Presence. Like standing too close to something massive, and still aware that it could move if it chose to. The trees ahead parted. Not physically. Perceptually. Space warped in a way that made distance unreliable. The clearing beyond looked closer than it was. The snow unnaturally smooth. And in the center of it, something stood that had never needed to move quickly to survive. It was tall, taller than any man. But height wasn't the wrong part. Proportion was. Its limbs bent with an economy that defied joints. Its surface wasn't fur or bark or skin, but something between layered, textured, grown rather than formed. It didn't breathe. It didn't sway. It simply was. Silence collapsed inward around it. Not an absence of sound, but a suppression. Even my thoughts felt quieter, as if they'd been dampened by proximity. I understood then why the forest goes quiet. This wasn't a predator in the way we understand predators. It wasn't malicious. It didn't hate us. It occupied this land the way mountains occupy space. By existing, by enduring. We were the intrusion. Temporary. Fragile. Caleb whimpered softly beside me. The sound didn't travel. The thing regarded us. No eyes but attention. A focus that pressed against my chest. Searching, cataloging. When it moved, it did so without urgency, adjusting its stance by inches. Snow compressed beneath it, without sound. Then it mimicked us, not with voice this time, but with posture. Its upper mass shifted, approximating the way a human stands at rest. Close. Almost right. Wrong in ways that made my stomach lurch. I lowered my rifle again, not in surrender, in acknowledgement. We're leaving, I said, not to Caleb, but to the presence. My voice sounded small, thin, like it might snap. The thing tilted, considering. I felt a pressure against my memories then, not invasive. Curious. Flashes surfaced, me at the academy, my first winter patrol. Caleb laughing, over burnt coffee. It wasn't stealing them. It was tasting the shape of us. Understanding settled like frost. This was a boundary keeper, not a monster, not a god. Something older than categories. It didn't hunt us because it didn't need to. It corrected imbalances. Removed what lingered too long. Replaced what belonged elsewhere. I realized in why it practiced voices. Why it learned names. It wasn't luring for cruelty. It was offering continuity. A way for the forest to speak in familiar tones. Caleb sank to his knees. That was the mistake. The thing reacted instantly, not attacking, but advancing. Distance folded. One moment it was across the clearing. The next it loomed over him, vast and inevitable. The silence intensified, crushing. I stepped between them, without thinking. Enough, I said. The word felt absurd. Authority meant nothing here. My badge was meaningless. My weapon was a toy. But intent matters in old places. I held my ground, heart hammering, fully aware of how small I was. The presence paused. Its attention shifted to me, heavy and assessing. I felt myself weighed, not judged, but measured. My willingness to stay, to speak, to accept consequence. A decision crystallized. We'll go, I said, and we won't come back. That was the bargain. Simple. Final. The thing withdrew a fraction. The pressure eased. Space returned something like normal. The forest exhaled, sound bleeding back into the edges. Wind through needles, the distant creak of frozen branches. Caleb gasped, sucking air like he'd been underwater. The presence retreated, step by impossible step, dissolving into shadow until it was no longer distinct from the trees. The clearing remained, empty and untouched, as if nothing had ever stood there at all. We didn't run. We backed away slowly, eyes forward, until the pines thinned and the world felt slightly less oppressive. Only when the outpost came into view did my legs start to shake. Inside, Caleb broke down. Full body sobs, shock releasing its grip. I sat with him until it passed, my own hands trembling now that the danger had receded. We didn't speak of what we'd seen. Not then. I knew the choice I'd made carried weight. Leaving meant abandoning post, violating duty, but staying would have meant something worse. An invitation, a misunderstanding the forest would eventually correct. As night fell again, Christmas lights flickered faintly in my memory. Things from another life. I stared at the radio. Knowing what came next wouldn't be the encounter itself. It would be explaining why we left, and deciding how much truth the world could survive. The official report was 3 pages long. The truth wouldn't fit on one. We left at first light without ceremony. No farewell patrol. No final sweep. Just a quiet departure that felt like retreat, though I knew it was closer to surrender. The forest didn't follow us. It didn't need to. Whatever boundary we crossed had been acknowledged, corrected, and sealed behind us. Caleb rode in silence the entire way back to the main road. His hand shook on controls, knuckles white, eyes fixed ahead like he was afraid to look anywhere else. When we finally reached a zone with reliable signal, dispatch came through like nothing had happened. Cheerful, routine, asking for status updates and weather conditions. I gave them half-truths wrapped in procedural language. Equipment malfunction, environmental stressors, ranger fatigue. Enough to justify our exit. Without inviting questions, I wasn't prepared to answer. They sent medical. At the station, Caleb collapsed the moment his boots hit the concrete. His legs simply gave out, like the weight he'd been carrying finally realized it didn't need to hold him upright anymore. The medic said it was hypothermia and shock. That was accurate, just not complete. I sat with him in the infirmary while he slept, jaw clenched, murmuring words I couldn't make out. Once, he reached for my sleeve and whispered my name, not in fear but confusion, like he was checking whether I was real. The next day, we were separated. Standard procedure after a winter incident. Independent statements. Independent evaluations. It's meant to preserve accuracy. What it really does is isolate memory, keep it from reinforcing itself across witnesses. I didn't know that then. I know it now. The report took hours to write. 3 pages. That's the recommended length for environmental incidents without loss of life. I described weather patterns, wildlife displacement, communication failures. I used phrases like anomalous conditions and perceived auditory interference. I avoided specifics, names, the word voice. Every sentence felt like erasure. There was a section labeled narrative summary. I stared at it for a long time before typing. I wanted to write about the snow moving, about the silence that crushed thought, about the way something ancient had looked at us like weather looks at stone. Instead, I wrote that we encountered unsafe conditions and exercised ranger discretion to withdraw. Discretion is a powerful word. It absolves without explaining. Caleb's statement was shorter. He stuck to facts, but his hand shook so badly the letters slanted across the page. He mentioned hearing his name. The review officer circled it in red and wrote stress response in the margin. 2 days later, Caleb requested extended leave. They approved it immediately. I visited him once more before he left the park. He looked older somehow, like the forest had taken something invisible but essential. He wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't talk about the pines. When I tried to apologize, tried to explain why I hadn't called for extraction sooner, he shook his head. "It knew you," he said quietly. "That's what scares me." Then he was gone. Weeks passed. Christmas came and went like a rumor. Snow kept falling. The northeast sector was quietly reassigned. The Pine Corridor didn't appear on any updated maps. It simply remained blank, a negative space no one acknowledged. An internal memo circulated reminding rangers to adhere strictly to marked trails and avoid unscheduled patrol deviations. No mention of why. No mention of us. That's how institutions protect themselves. They don't deny. They redirect. I carried the guilt like a second pack. Guilt for staying silent. Guilt for choosing the boundary over my partner. Guilt for knowing that what we encountered would never be studied, never be understood, because understanding it would require admitting we aren't alone on land we claim to manage. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the encounter in my head, wonder what would have happened if I'd fired, if I'd run, if I'd spoken sooner. The thing about old places is that they don't offer closure. They offer consequence. Caleb never returned to field work. Last I heard, he transferred to an administrative role far from forests. He stopped answering my messages after a while. I don't blame him. As for me, I stayed. Someone had to. If you've ever been told to forget something for the sake of order, you know how heavy that silence becomes. You carry it into every decision, every patrol, every glance toward a place you're not supposed to remember. The report was filed. The incident closed. Officially, nothing unusual occurred, but the closure held. That's what no one could explain. No avalanches, no fires, no wildlife incursions. Just a quiet, persistent absence of access. Permits denied. Routes rerouted. A stretch of forest that remained untouched not because of danger, but because something there had been acknowledged and respected. I didn't understand it fully then. I only knew that some places don't need fences or signs. They need witnesses who know when to step back. Years later, when a junior ranger asked me why that area was still off limits despite perfect conditions, I felt the weight of that old decision settle again. Because the truth wasn't about what we saw. It was about what we agreed never to disturb again. People think the closure is about avalanches. It's not. That's the explanation printed on visitor pamphlets and internal safety briefings. Unstable terrain, increased winter slide risk, environmental recovery. All technically true in the way most lies are built from real parts. Snow does pile deep there. Slopes do shift. But those hazards exist all over Yellowstone, and they've never stopped us from reopening ground once conditions stabilize. The Lamar Pines never stabilized. The closure outlasted seasons, then years. What started as a temporary restriction quietly hardened into permanence. Barriers weren't erected. Signs weren't posted. Instead, routes were redrawn. Patrol maps updated with subtle bends that guided rangers away from the corridor without ever naming it. New hires learned the terrain from those maps alone, never realizing something had been excised. And those of us who knew better didn't correct them. Patrol behavior changed first. Not officially, nothing that would trigger a review, but instinctively. Rangers lingered less on the northeastern edge. Snowmobile tracks stopped approaching certain tree lines. When wildlife collars pinged near the corridor, monitoring teams rerouted rather than investigate directly. Drones lost signal over that stretch more often than data could explain. And eventually, they were grounded entirely due to technical inconsistency. The forest learned us as surely as we learned it. Every so often, subtle signs surface, small, deniable things. A maintenance crew reporting audio feedback that mimicked their own voices during radio tests. A survey team losing 40 minutes of recorded time with no equipment failure logged. Once, a visitor claimed they'd heard a ranger calling their name near a closed boundary, only to find no one there. That report never made it past intake. We told ourselves it was easier this way, safer. The truth is, avoidance worked. No disappearances, no incidents, no escalation. The absence became its own kind of proof. Whatever presence kept that ground held respect to the boundary we'd drawn, so long as we honored it in return. That left people like me in an impossible position. As the years passed, I moved up more responsibility, more authority. I signed off on patrol schedules, approved route adjustments, answered questions from seasonal staff who wanted to know why certain areas felt avoided. I learned how to redirect curiosity with practiced ease. Terrain issues, budget constraints, long-term ecological monitoring. All true, all incomplete. Every once in a while, someone pushed, usually younger rangers, the kind who still believed every closure had a solution if you worked hard enough. They'd come to my office with maps spread out, pointing to the blank space between trails. Why here, they'd ask. Conditions look perfect. I'd feel that old weight settle in my chest, the memory of snow rippling, of silence pressing inward, of a voice wearing mine. And I'd say, carefully, some places don't need to be accessed to be protected. Most accepted that. A few didn't. Those ones transferred out eventually. Not because I forced them to, but because the park has a way of filtering people who won't let questions rest. The presence never announced itself again. Not overtly. Not the way it had that Christmas. But there were moments, standing watch at dusk, feeling the forest's attention shift. Times when the pines seemed closer than they should be, branches leaning inward like they were listening for something familiar. Once, years later, I found fresh depressions in the snow near the old boundary. Not tracks, not prints, just wide, shallow impressions that suggested weight without form. They vanished by morning. I didn't report them. That's the moral compromise no one prepares you for. Not the choice between right and wrong, but between truth and protection. If I told everything I knew, really told it, people would want proof, access, exploration, answers. They'd send teams and instruments and experts who would treat the corridor like a puzzle to be solved. And puzzles demand interaction. I've seen what happens when boundaries are mistaken for challenges. The land doesn't argue. It corrects. So I stayed quiet. I trained others to do the same, without ever naming the reason. I let the official explanation stand because it kept feet from crossing a line that shouldn't be tested again. Some nights, I wonder if that makes me complicit, a liar, a coward. Other nights, I remember Caleb's face when the thing spoke his name. I remember how small we were in that clearing, how irrelevant our authority felt. And I know silence was the only language that worked. The closure persists because it's respected by us and by whatever still occupies that ground. A mutual agreement held together by absence and restraint. That's a fragile thing. Lately, though, I've noticed changes. Subtle at first. Budget reviews questioning long-standing closures. Increased interest in used park space from administrative offices far from the forest. New technology promising better mapping, better signal penetration, better control, better understanding. Understanding is dangerous. A memo crossed my desk last fall proposing a limited winter survey of the northeastern sector. Just a feasibility study. Just data collection. My name was on the approval line. I stared at it longer than I should have. The forest hasn't forgotten us. I know that as surely as I know my own name. It learned it once. It could learn it again. Boundaries hold only as long as they're honored by both sides. If we break ours, I don't know what it will do. So I delayed, asked for revisions, requested additional safety assessments, bought time the only way institutions allow, through process. But time has a way of thinning, just like snow under pressure. This winter marks 14 years, since that Christmas Eve. 14 years of quiet. 14 years of absence mistaken for emptiness. People still think the closure is about avalanches. It's not. It's about remembering that some truths, once exposed, don't make us safer. They make us interesting. And out there in the pines, something ancient has always paid attention to interesting things. If the closure lifts, if curiosity finally outweighs caution, I'm not sure the forest will be as accommodating the second time. And I don't know if I'll be able to stay silent much longer. If you're planning to visit Yellowstone in winter, don't follow voices in the snow. I've replayed those words in my head more times than I can count, usually when the nights get long and the cold settles into my bones the way it did that year. 14 winters have passed since the Lamar Pines taught me how small we really are. 14 winters of quiet that people mistake for peace. This is the part where stories usually end, with survival, with lessons learned, with the danger neatly contained in the past. But the truth is, nothing ever really ends out there. The land remembers. It always has. Yellowstone isn't just scenery. It's not a backdrop for photographs or a destination on a map. It's a living system older than any uniform, any law, any name we've given it. Every valley, every ridge, every stand of pine carries memory the way stone carries heat. Long after footsteps fade, the ground remembers their weight. I learned that work in the winter shifts when the park strips itself down to essentials. No crowds, no engines, no distractions, just cold distance and the uneasy sense that you're being tolerated rather than welcomed. You start to feel like a guest who's overstayed without realizing it. People ask me sometimes why I stayed after that Christmas. Why I didn't transfer out like Caleb did. The honest answer is that leaving didn't feel like an option, not because of loyalty or duty, but because someone had to remember where the boundary was. Someone had to know why the maps bend the way they do. The land doesn't need us to believe in it. It doesn't need acknowledgement or reverence. It exists on its own terms. What it reacts to is interference. Curiosity without respect. Movement without understanding. That presence in the pines wasn't angry. It wasn't hunting us. It didn't want to punish or terrify. It corrected and imbalanced the way ecosystems always do. We stepped somewhere we didn't belong, lingered too long, and it responded with the minimum force required to make its point. That's what still unsettles me. Evil is easier to understand. You can fight it. You can run from it. You can name it and tell yourself you'd act differently next time. What we encountered didn't fit into that shape. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't malicious. It was inevitable. The forest goes quiet around it because sound is wasted. Movement is unnecessary. Everything living knows when still itself. Humans are the exception. We feel silence because we're afraid of what it might contain. Every winter since, I've paid attention to the small things. How certain animals refuse to cross invisible lines, even when food is scarce. How snowfall behaves differently near the corridor, settling deeper, smoother, as if the ground beneath it breathes at a slower pace. How radios still glitch there, just enough to remind you that signal isn't guaranteed. Once, years after closure became permanent, I stood near the old boundary at dusk, conducting a routine wildlife count. The light was failing fast, the sky turning that deep, endless blue that only winter brings. For a moment, I thought I heard someone call my name. I didn't answer. The sound didn't repeat itself. The forest remained still. Somewhere deep among the pines, I felt, not heard, a shift, like acknowledgement, like something checking to see if I'd learned. I backed away slowly, the way I had before. That's what people don't understand about warnings. They aren't about fear. They're about survival. The rules we pass down quietly, the ones that never make it into brochures or training manuals, exist because someone paid a price to learn them. Caleb paid part of that price. So did I, not with blood or disappearance, but with something harder to measure: certainty, comfort, the belief that authority grants control. I think about him often, about the way his face changed when the thing spoke his name, about how fast confidence drains when reality refuses to behave. He never went back into the field, but the forest followed him anyway, not physically, internally. You don't unlearn that kind of awareness. Sometimes I wonder if the presence remembers him too, if it catalogs us the way we catalog species, if somewhere in that vast, patient awareness, there's a record of the two rangers who came too close and learned when to leave. The park still stands. Tourists still come. Seasons still turn. From the outside, nothing has changed. That's the most dangerous part. People assume that because the land looks the same, it behaves the same. They assume silence means absence. It doesn't. Silence means restraint. Every year, someone ignores closures, steps off marked trails, follows a sound because it feels familiar. Rangers usually find them quickly, cold and shaken but alive. Those cases are easy to explain: exposure, disorientation, hypothermia. The harder ones are the near misses. The hikers who swear they heard a friend calling for help where no one should have been. The campers who wake to footprints circling their tents that don't match any known animal. The visitors who leave early because something about the forest felt wrong. Those stories don't make headlines. They don't need to. They're warnings that worked. I'm telling you this now because memory fades and institutions change. People who weren't there start asking questions without understanding the answers. Budgets tighten. Technology advances. Someone always believes they can solve what others respected. If that happens, if the boundaries cross again, I don't know what the forest will do. I only know it will respond. The land is a witness. It has watched species rise and vanish, watched ice retreat and return, watched humans arrive with fire and tools and names for everything they didn't understand. We are temporary guests, no matter how permanent our structures feel. What still watches the pines doesn't need worship or fear. It needs distance, recognition, the humility to accept that not everything exists for us to catalog or conquer. So here's a warning, stripped of drama and superstition. If you're in Yellowstone in winter and you hear your name carried on the wind, don't answer. If a voice sounds familiar but comes from a place that feels wrong, don't follow it. If the forest goes quiet all at once, stop moving. Turn back the way you came. Respect the closure even if you don't understand it, especially if you don't understand it, because misunderstanding is often the first warning. When a place refuses to explain itself, when it resists being reduced to signs, maps, or reasons that fit neatly into human logic, that resistance matters. Not everything that is closed is broken. Some things are closed because they are complete on their own. We're taught to believe danger announces itself, that it growls, charges, or leaves obvious signs behind. But the most dangerous places are often calm, silent, patient. They don't threaten you because they don't have to. They don't need fear to protect themselves. They simply exist, indifferent to whether you acknowledge them or not. Some places aren't dangerous because they want to hurt you. They're dangerous because they don't need you at all. That's a hard truth for people to accept. We like to believe we belong everywhere we step, that our presence is neutral at worst, welcome at best. But land doesn't think in those terms. It doesn't measure worth by curiosity or courage. It measures weight, time, impact, and when something has existed long enough, it stops making room. Curiosity is not evil. It's human, but curiosity becomes arrogance the moment we assume that interest equals permission, when we mistake silence for absence, when we step past the boundaries simply because no one stopped us loudly enough. That's when correction happens. And the land doesn't correct the way humans do. There's no anger in it, no satisfaction, no cruelty, just balance being restored. Patiently, efficiently, without malice. It doesn't chase you. It doesn't argue. It waits until you show it exactly how much space you think you deserve. And then it shows you how little of that space was ever yours. That's the lesson I learned. Not in the classroom, not in training, but standing in snow, so quiet felt like the world had paused to watch me decide. I learned that authority means nothing without consent, that uniforms don't grant protection, and that some warnings are meant to be felt, not understood. I've lived with that knowledge for 14 years. It hasn't faded. It hasn't softened. It's settled into me, shaping the way I walk, the way I listen, the way I stop myself from asking questions that don't need answers. It's taught me restraint and humility and respect for things that will outlast every story we tell about them. I don't expect you to believe me. Belief isn't required for boundaries to exist. The land doesn't care whether you believe. It only cares what you do when the forest goes quiet. I only hope you listen.